I'm the chair of the board of Create for Education, and we're glad to have you join us today. But before we begin, on behalf of all four presenters, we want to recognize that today is Juneteenth. Juneteenth is a celebration of freedom, but also a celebration of the spirit. On this important day, we take the time to recognize and honor the hardships and the dignity of Black men, women, and children who were enslaved in the US. As President Obama said, Juneteenth is a time to recommit ourselves to the world and to the work that remains to be done. This is a time of change, exciting change, I hope, in which issues of diversity, inclusion, and deep understanding of systemic and structural racism is sweeping through communities. As teachers and parents, this awareness is critically important for supporting children and creating the kinds of communities we really want to create. So it's really critical for all of us to look at ourselves, our own unconscious biases, our conscious and our unconscious acts that have implicitly or explicitly supported systemic and structural racism. And really to more deeply understand how each of us can face these issues with forthrightness and also with kindness. We need to speak up. We need to teach ourselves, our children, how to identify, engage, and dismantle racism and oppression within ourselves and among those around us. May we all grow to meet this essential challenge. Now, she started by talking about my interest in well-being, which is the reason for the development of the Create nonprofit. And to move more specifically to the topic of today, as educators, we all know our lives have changed forever. We've all experienced trauma in some form. As schools begin to make plans to reopen, it's imperative we address the effects of the pandemic experience, not only for our students, but also for the adults who work with them, for ourselves. This webinar will discuss ideas about how schools can begin to rebuild a sense of community, including exploring adult social and emotional needs, collaborating on strategies to build caring communities with our students and our colleagues. And I want to start by introducing my three panelists that will join me today. Joining us today are Denine Goolsby, Dr. Joe Gerics, and the CEO of Create, Dorothy Morelli. Denine Goolsby began her career as a teacher and then became an assistant principal and a principal in Cleveland Heights School District outside of Cleveland. Then she served as the executive director of Humanware. That's the SEL division of the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. And now she serves as a principal's coach and a social emotional resource consultant for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, as well as the Warrensville Heights School District. And Denine is a board member of Create. Welcome, Denine.
Greetings, Mark. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it abundantly clear that no matter what your role, your voice is needed as we plan for the new normal.
Thank you, Denine. And let me introduce Dr. Joe Gerics. Joe has served in the field of education for 16 years with both classroom teaching and administrative experience. He currently holds the position of SEL manager with the Cleveland Metropolitan Schools. And Joe's a specialist in childhood trauma, and he's provided trainings on trauma-informed classrooms and schools in numerous districts in the US. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Mark. It's an absolute privilege to be here today to talk about this ever-changing topic. In my position as an SEL manager, I was in schools on a daily basis and had firsthand experience with how much our teachers do for our students. And I know that this has been a stressful time for teachers. I'm married to a teacher, and one of the things is that my wife, and I'm sure this echoes across the nation with teachers, is I didn't get to say goodbye. And that is really distressing for teachers. So I'm happy again to be here to discuss this.
Great, Joe, and excited to have your expertise with us. And let me lastly introduce Dorothy Morelli. Dorothy's a career educator, having served in many roles, from a pre-K teacher to an administrator. She's currently the CEO of Create and SEL Worldwide, and has provided training to schools on the use of the PATHS curriculum and provided broader systems consultation for SEL to many schools in the US and around the world. Welcome, Dorothy.
Thanks, Mark. I'm so glad to be here today with others that care about education and our teachers. Teachers are vital for the success of our school communities, and I'm just appreciative in your leadership and helping make sure we help teachers and we learn from them.
Well, about 2 months ago, Denine and Joe and Dorothy and I were talking, and we were thinking there's a lot of talk about PE and all the rituals that we need to change in schools, how busing patterns will work and how classrooms will work, and will they be online or will they be face-to-face? But no one seemed to be talking about how we're going to prepare ourselves emotionally and socially, and how we're going to prepare our teachers and our children to really come back to learning in a way that's loving and respectful and appreciates everyone that's involved. Uh, so I want to turn to Denine now. And Denine, let's start with the issues of COVID. I'd like to begin with COVID and its effects on teachers. COVID created really abrupt changes in the lives for teachers. Can you tell me what your thoughts are about that?
Yes, Mark. One of the initial directives of the pandemic was shelter in place. So immediately, everyone's lives changed. They were snatched from wherever they were and were not allowed to do some of the things that we find as normal in our lives. We could not go to movies and plays. We couldn't go to the store without a mask. There were just changes that made a whole difference in all of us. So for our teachers, that is earth shattering because one day you're with your children, the next day you're not. And then you don't have an opportunity to close with them. So the lack of closure for our educators was an issue. But educators are resilient. Not only did they have to recognize that there was a change, they knew that they had to do things differently. So, as we always do, we come together, we make plans, and we make it work for our children. So our teachers have had to dig deep and find other talents that they may not have even realized that they had to make sure that things were great for our young people.
Thanks, Denine.
Mhm.
Let me go a little farther with you. Now that schools in the US are going to begin to reopen, and we know they're going to reopen in very different ways, in different stages and at different times, what are the issues we need to address in the reopening?
As we ponder social distancing guidelines, we must consider how we will collaborate with our colleagues to optimize the educational opportunities for our students. We have to do this in multiple platforms because it is going to look different. The ultimate question, of course, is will we be physically and emotionally safe? As educators across the world grapple with these and many other questions, it is imperative that we focus on the collective efficacy of the adults. Research supports that it is the relationships of the adults in the school that shape its culture. Therefore, reconnecting and working to design an environment where everyone feels valued is paramount.
So we really need to build, I guess, what we'd call a culture of empathy. And Denine, you were a principal for quite a while. I wonder if you could reflect back on your time as a principal. If you were a principal now and you were coming back to school, what would you consider doing to reassure both teachers and parents?
The principal has the pleasure of impacting lives on a large scale. During that time that you are working with students, you are also working with their families. And the way you build relationships with your families and your students is to offer them open communication, honesty, and trust. I would take the opportunity to build on those components to build a new school for our children. So every entity of our school community would be involved in the conversation. They would be a part of the decision making, and it would be an open and honest forum about our challenges and how we will face those challenges. Transparency, trust, and inclusion go a long way. People appreciate that.
Transparency, trust, and inclusion. I couldn't have said it better, Denine.
That's a
And
compliment.
and she opened by talking about a brief that we had written for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on teacher stress and well-being. But more recently, we've written one on principles called the pro-social leader, where we develop a model where we believe that the most important role of the principal is just what you're saying, is to make sure that every person every teacher, every parent, every staff member, every child feels seen and listened to and appreciated and really loved. And we believe that that's the key role of a principal in today's school. And it couldn't be needed more now than ever.
Right, absolutely. I agree.
So you were also the director. You've had a lot of roles. You were the director of humanware for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. It was a Castle District. It is a Castle District school. As the director of humanware, you directed social emotional learning for, I think, about somewhere around 80 schools, I think, in Cleveland. What did you see happen? You probably saw schools that really took on SEL seriously to create systems change, and maybe some schools that really were focused on other things and didn't take it up in the same way. What did you see when SEL really was working well in the district?
In the schools that took on social emotional learning to create systems change, we witnessed a greater sense of community. Expectations were clear, and restorative practices were in place when the schools were faced with challenges. And of course, academic achievement scores increased, and that is the target, to make sure that our children are learning at high levels. The integration of SEL and instruction must go hand in hand. Teaching the core competencies of SEL builds strong life skills. Self-awareness, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making, and self-management skills are all skills we need throughout life. So integrating those skills in our instruction is integral to our success.
Well, as one of the founders of Castle, Castle believes that curriculums are an important component, but the most important components is really the leadership of creating a healthy school that has a sustainable and systemic model of how to implement SEL, not just as curriculum, but as policies and practices. It's really as relationships, how we want to be with each other in a building. And it's great to hear that when schools really take that on well, not only does it improve the quality of trust and transparency, as you're saying, but also we've seen lots of data to show its effects on academic achievement.
Yes, yes.
So Joe, maybe we can turn and talk a bit about kids now instead of the adults. Let's talk a little bit about trauma and the different degrees and types of trauma that especially students, but teachers and parents have also experienced, and how we might understand this trauma in a way that leads us to consider what things we should be doing in the reopening process.
Sure, thanks, Mark. I think you hit it right on the head. We all have experienced some trauma during this pandemic. It hit right at the core of how we operate our daily lives, right? And no one, I believe, is going to come through this unaltered to some aspect. And so it's really important that as we reconnect, we take time to acknowledge that life as we know it, it might be changed forever, right? And so in that acknowledgement, we must also take time to explore how are these changes going to impact our schools, our students, our teachers? And this requires us to reflect on these recent experiences and how it's really altered our perceptions and in turn affected our actions. When you think about returning to the classroom, and I would like to open this up to our participants, I'm really interested in what word resonates with you the most when you return to your classroom.
And Chi, I think we're going to do a poll. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, in looking at these results, are you seeing what I'm seeing with this?
Yeah, people have a lot of mixed emotions, huh?
Right. Yeah, all the above. And, I believe that when I talked about even returning to the classroom, some of you may have been experiencing a sinking feeling as to what is the classroom community going to even look like for next year? Some of those emotions may have been frustration, confusion, and even grief, right? That disconnect of, again, I mentioned earlier, of not being able to say goodbye to students that you've cared for all year long. Questions may be swirling in your mind centered around, how on earth will I ever be able to get back to normal in the classroom? Being an educator and observing educators, I am absolutely convinced that teachers really are among the nation's most resilient and adaptable professionals. They really are. And they really realized that it is important that we focus on rebuilding relationships and really supporting SEL for our students as they return, right? We want to create welcoming environments, and really important is creating that sense of safety. We know one thing with trauma is that when change occurs, it really triggers because it communicates a level of being unsafe. And so with this what it looks like coming back, and not that the realm of the unknown, that's going to be the realm in which many of our students and our families are going to be in. What's this going to look like? So that's even more important as to why we really focus on building a culture of empathy. We need to strengthen those relationships in the classroom, right? Through nurturing and caring, but not just for children, really for adults as well. It would be really interesting to witness the different designs that really emerge as we as educators nationwide, and not even nationwide, globally tackle this, right? What's going to emerge as these plans unfold on what rebuilding this community will look like. I really believe that we need to recognize our collective talents for nurturing these relationships, right? It's so that it leads us to resolution. I believe that if we successfully focus on connection and engagement as the cornerstones for returning to school, we'll be able then to turn our attention to engagement for learning, those academics, and for school success.
Great, Joe. That's really important what you've had to say. And it really focuses on the trauma side of things. I wonder if we could sort of turn it on its head and think now about how we build strengths and assets in our youth.
Right. That's a great question, Mark. You know, when we look at trauma and sometimes how it's approached in the classroom, trauma formed at times, if we're not careful, can lend itself to a deficit view of our students. They have all this going on, right? And so we focus on maybe those deficits rather than focusing on strengths and those assets that each and every one of our children bring to the classroom. And when we talk about assets, what do I mean by that, right? And not to sound cliche as to what strengths are, but we also have to be inclusive with viewing assets as cultural identity, right? Familial background, history, things that our children are able to build upon strengths within themselves to overcome barriers and hurdles that may have been placed in front of them through different traumatic experiences.
You know, we're all trying to deal, Joe, with what life brings us. And this has not been it's been a difficult time for all of us. But we can access our deeper desires and values. And I think this is also where our history and our heritage comes from, to deal with things and cope more effectively. Things I think we've learned during the pandemic, I think there's a couple things. One is we learned how interdependent we are, and how much we miss each other, how much we miss the physical presence of each other. I think we've also developed a greater appreciation for others. Many of us are on phone calls, not for 5 minutes with our family, but for hours. And lastly, I think what you and Denine have already said is that we've also learned that we are resilient and that we can bounce back if we have the right environmental supports. I think a big part of that is we've been talking about is how positive is the attachments between teachers in the buildings, between teachers and principals, between students and teachers, and between parents and teachers. And attachments develop, healthy attachments develop from developing trust. And trust often develops by just being truly present with others. To the extent that we're really with others, we're really deeply listening to them, we're really hearing them and really taking in their views, their emotions, their concerns, their desires, their hopes. The more we really listen to someone truly and deeply listen, it naturally makes us feel closer. It makes us feel more supported, and it makes us feel cared for. So one of the key aspects, I think, of being a true teacher or a caring parent is the ability to deeply listen, especially when it's hard. Interestingly, yesterday, the National Education Association came out with a very important report. I think it's very timely, and I think it's very thoughtful regarding plans for return. And of course, there are the parts of the plan that are about the procedural aspects of returning to school. The report's called All Hands on Deck, and afterwards, when you receive an email, Chi will put this URL for this report in the email. It has a lot of interesting things in it. It talks about the importance of well-being of teachers, of student empowerment and agency. But I just want to point to a couple things that they said. They said it's important to train staff in trauma-informed practices, to strengthen the trauma-informed culture for a school, and prepare to communicate effectively and empathetically with students about the pandemic, about their experiences, and about the necessary changes that will occur in their school because of this. They even suggested considering having schools consider suspending most academic instruction for the first 2 weeks to start school, with instead having a focus on social emotional learning activities and supporting children to, as well as adults, to deal with the grief and the loss and to come back and reconnect together. They also suggest that these social emotional supports should be continued throughout the school year and integrated, and of course, into students' regular learning, as Denine has said, is already done well in great schools in Cleveland. They also suggest we consider a couple of things. They consider how might staff benefit from a mental wellness and self-care program that continues throughout the whole year for staff to help staff avoid burnout and vicarious trauma. They ask the question, what will a trauma-informed school culture look like in each school building? And of course, it'll look different in different places. And they ask an important question: how do we promote and include self-care for educators as an integrated part of school culture? This is a far-reaching report in that sense, because this is really the first report, I think, from a teachers union, and a very important report that really focuses both on the trauma and the well-being of both teachers and students. Joe or Denine, any comments on this?
Yeah, Mark, in coming out, I think that's paramount, right? First, on so many levels. Really, first, as educational body, to come out and say that it is so important that we lend time and give credence to students' social emotional needs, that this is paramount and foundational for learning, right? And incorporated that is acknowledging the trauma that both our students and adults have gone through, and formulating a plan to tackle this. I think that it's absolutely essential.
And I would agree, Joe. As we know, as adults, if we have relationships with people, we may be apt to do a little bit more for that person than if we don't. So our young people need relationships. They need to know that the adults that are there with them are serving as their advocates. And the way to do that is to build relationship building right into the curriculum and their actions in their routines and practices in their schools. So I love that part about beginning the school year with that first, because once you have your routines and practices in place, anything is possible. Once you have the trust of your parents and they know that you are working to build their students universally, they appreciate that. So I love this report. I can't wait to delve into it.
And if I might add, Mark, I'd say academics and SEL are like peanut butter and jelly. They were never meant to be apart, right? That in talking about this integrative process, for so long they've run parallel tracks, but never really had that intersection. I'm seeing now that we're really, through bodies of research, moving towards that these are truly meant to be an integrated process together, and that is exciting.
You're right, Joe, and this is not new in a sense, and that John Dewey wrote extensively about this in the 1890s, how integrated affect and cognition are, how a true education would be an education of both. And of course, many people from Aristotle to the Dalai Lama have said very similar things, and yet schools have had a hard time taking up the wisdom of this. It's a slow process, because schools are by nature, and very probably positively, the most conservative institution we have, because it's one of the only institutions left that we all participate in. So it's natural for this to be a slow process, and it's very important that social emotional learning be done well, be empirically based, and be personalized to the culture and the context of school buildings. So Dorothy, let me turn to you about all this. You're the master. You've been in more buildings and more schools and more countries than just about anyone I've ever met. Could you tell us what CREATE is doing and to help schools rebuild their communities?
Sure, Mark. It's just a pleasure to work with teachers and leaders throughout the world, and we've been listening to them. And we've been thinking about how do we help teachers and communities rebuild their own community. And as a result, using best practices, we have developed an interactive training, which can be done online or it can be done face-to-face. And it's really an innovative one-day in-service to support the rebuilding of our communities. I think what's really important is the first part of the day, the first half, is focused just on teacher well-being. We've all said this in different ways. Our teachers have to be well themselves to take care of others. So the first part of the day is just reflection and thinking about what teachers have gone through and how they coped. And then the second part of the one-day training is really about helping teachers learn more about how to teach children coping strategies. Because I think we as adults have lots of different coping strategies that children don't have. And it's important that we teach them these because, as Denine said earlier, these are lifelong skills. So we know it's going to be a challenge for principals, teachers, and staff to go back. But we know if we all work together and we prepare ourselves and that their students will have the best reopening possible. And you know, the other thing is we've talked about resilience and teachers are resilient. And yes, Joe, I'm married to a teacher as well, but we know that teachers also are hopeful. They want their children, their students, their scholars to have hope. And when we work with teachers, not only are we going to be working with helping with coping strategies, but we're also going to be talking about hope. Hope not just for our teachers, not just for our students, but for the broader school community as well. So the train the trainer model, you might want to ask Mark, is open to both individuals, so maybe people like principals or teachers or counselors. And we also have a district model that allows staff to train their own school communities. This model also provides ongoing consultation for the school year because, as Mark said, systematic transformation is not just a one day and finished. It's really looking at broader goals that we all want to achieve together.
Great, Dorothy. You know, it brings me back to attachment again and trust because, you know, as adults, we've been through a lot, and dealing with our own issues is important because, you know, what happens in life is that we co-regulate each other. That is, we not only have self-regulation in the way that we talk about in the Castle 5 of competencies, but we also are regulated by our relationship with others. And you well know that when you are with a neurotic friend versus with a calm friend, you're different because you're you're regulated in some sense, not just by yourself, but by the people around you. And it's the same thing in the classroom. Teachers are critical in helping children to co-regulate. And the more that teachers themselves have it together, have a sense of presence, are listening deeply, are really with it, we call with itness in the classroom, children then follow. And the same thing happens at the level of the school. That is, the extent that the principal, she or he has taken care of themselves and are in the right space, they're able to also co-regulate teachers and parents and all the staff in a school to create this kind of loving family environment that we all yearn for our children to be involved in. So thank you. I think we would like to go to questions probably now. And Chi, are there any questions already in the chat that we might want to focus on?
Yeah, Mark, there are a couple, and I want to just go ahead and start with Boji's question. How can we make connections and create a new safe space virtually? It was okay at the end of the year when we have already made connections, but I'm worried about starting with a brand new group.
Would anyone, any of us on the panel like to take this? Well, I'd be glad to start. I think that that one of the important issues here is again, it's all about relationships, and it's going to be very hard. I think that it's a good recognition to understand how difficult it will be to start a new year virtually. And I think the most important thing that teachers can try to do is to get a list as soon as possible. I know it's not there yet, but soon, of who's going to be in their classroom, at least most of the children that might be in their classroom, and begin to develop one-on-one relationships. I think it's important that they just have a phone call, a Zoom call, or whatever you use as your system, to get to know the child and the family, to find out what the child likes to do, what movies they watch, what computer games they play, about their siblings or their family. So the children at least have some kinds of initial contacts with their teacher before the school year begins. Now, of course, some schools are thinking about looping. It's been recommended by many people in the education community, and I think some schools will do this. But I doubt that most will. And so developing these close relationships, beginning to develop them individually and with the parents online as soon as possible, I think will be one thing that could help. Any thoughts by the panel?
Yeah, Mark, I had a couple of thoughts. You know, in looking in the virtual classroom, I think it's really important to establish that what the community looks like, right? So because the community is sharing common characteristics and experiences. And so right now this classroom community is virtual. And in being that, I think it's really important to open up the sessions through the daily classroom activity virtually with a personal greeting or some sort of activity that makes those personal connections, because that's the one thing that I feel through virtual is lost. And I think that's kind of what everybody's pondering is, how can I make this personal for my students to rebuild that? So have to be intentional about establishing opening routines that invite everyone part of that classroom community to take part and to take action.
And
That's great. Oh, go ahead, Denine.
okay. Possibly one of those routines could be building their own their own classroom motto or mantra. They can think about what their classroom flag might be. Anything to connect them to the people that they are going to be with for the year would be important. So I agree with Joe. It is the relationships that we need to build, not only with our children, but with their parents and guardians, and making sure they know that we have them entrusted during their instruction. It's important to know what our children have available to them. Do they have the technology that they will need to learn virtually? All of those things we need to flush out before the year begins. Dorothy?
Thanks, Denine. So I was talking to a colleague of mine who has been a teacher for 28 years, and she said she was dreading this virtual transformation so badly. But she said she'd really come to learn some things. That one, she has seen more parent involvement instead of less, that she actually got to talk to parents more often, which was a real positive for her. She also said that she was able to see individual differences more. But the third thing that she said to me that I really thought was great, shy children, withdrawal children are finding their voice, whether it's through a chat, whether it's through a poll, whether it's through being able just to type something out to the teacher. So, you know, I do think all of these things, when we look at the positives, there are some things that are helping our students every single day with the virtual learning.
Thank you for that. We have another question from Kristen. Do you have an exemplar school that has a staff mental wellness or self-care plan?
Well, I think I could give you a couple examples, and maybe Joe or Denine could give others. An example of a school that we have worked with for a number of years is the Harriet Tubman School in Washington, D.C. With Principal Amanda Delabar. In that school, they have done an evidence-based SEL program. In this case, we know about it because it's the PATHS curriculum. But in addition, they've been doing ongoing work with teachers through the CARE program. And as you probably know, the CREATE nonprofit, createforeducation.org, not only is doing the kind of work we're talking about today, but we have been championing the quality implementation of evidence-based programs for teacher well-being. And CARE is the flagship program. So that's an example of one school. I think of another school in Cleveland, Clark School, that Amanda Rodriguez is the principal. Similarly, she's done both a strong SEL program in the school. She's done care with her teachers. And in addition, she's done another program we also have as part of CREATE. It's an evidence-based, every day, 20-minute in the morning, staff-focused yoga program called Calm, which we've shown not only improves teachers' well-being, but it improves their systolic and diastolic blood pressure and their awakening morning cortisol. That is, it improves them not only mentally, but also physiologically. And that's a school that's integrated all of these together. And that's what I'd call a true plan. It's a systemic plan that incorporates the needs of both teachers, all staff, secretaries, people in the cafeteria. Everyone can come in the morning. And in addition, a good SEL program for children.
And I would also say, Mark, that Amanda Rodriguez has really taken on the parent component, caregiver component, we should say. And that's been a huge part of her success, I think, is making sure that those caregivers of those children feel a part of that school community. And so I think that's the other component that she's done really well. And not just her, but her teachers, of course, and her staff.
We have another question I think is so important for the context. We've had several crises happen over the past 3 months: COVID, an economic recession, and critical social justice and racial issues to surface. How do we address all of these once-in-a-lifetime events when we reopen?
Well, I'll start. I don't think we can answer that by saying we should deal with all of them all at once, all in one big ball. I think we have to first develop a welcoming, caring, loving, trusting, transparent, as Denine said, atmosphere in the school. And I think when that's established, then it's going to be much easier to both learn academically, but also start to deal with many of the issues that children, as well as adults, have been frustrated, sad, disappointed, but also excited about. What could change about the future in many of our cities and towns that will create more racial justice and start to really seriously attack the systemic and structural racism we have. That's not only in our police departments, it's not only in our social services, it's in our education.
So along with that, Mark, I would like to add that as we're putting our teams together to explore how we will reopen, we need to always remember that our student voice is imperative to our success, because they are the ones that are actually experiencing what we as the adults believe is the right thing for them. So even your youngest child can tell you what they are experiencing and what they are feeling. So I have to put a plug in. You all know me. I have to put a plug in for student voice in this process.
Absolutely. And reflecting on my years as a teacher, and when events, and granted this year's been unprecedented, happen, I always worried about what am I going to say? And what I found to Denine's and validate Denine's point is the students would carry the conversation. I just had to create a safe place for that conversation to happen. And I think through acknowledging that this has happened, that we do have broken systems, students will take on the discussion parts. And we then, instead of leading, can step back as facilitators and facilitate organic, genuine dialogue. And I think that that's really what we're looking at here.
That's great. We have another question from Kim. What are some suggestions about working with scholars who do not have reliable internet access? There's a big equity issue here, and our school is currently in a red zone, so we might not even be able to start with in-person classes.
Joe or Denine, do you want to take that on, given that Cleveland also has this problem in a large degree?
So in looking at that specific issue, there's a lot of logistical moving parts, right? And it's first on, I believe, on the district's lens to say, hey, raise the flag, this is an issue. We understand this is an issue. I know in Cleveland, in partnership with, I believe it was Spectrum, we set up mobile hotspots all across the city. so that our children had access. Now, that doesn't happen overnight, right? So there has to be community relationships in place for that kind of effort to be moving. It just doesn't happen. Okay, we need hotspots here. So there needs to be dialogue. There needs to be expression of needs. And as a teacher, we are the primary advocates with this, right? We need to raise the red flag and say the tools that are needed for my children to be successful, the tools that are needed for my students to be successful are not in place. And I'm going to be the biggest advocates to make sure that that falls on ears that will actually be movers and shakers to make things happen.
So that just strengthens the need for knowing where our students are and what they have available to them. So in those initial touches, when we know where they're going to be placed and what's going to be happening in the fall, we need to touch base and make sure that all of them are connected.
Thank you for that. I know that when we reconvene, I think there's a question here in the box, but I wanted to actually ask something that's been top of my mind. Mark, you talked about co-regulation and self-regulation as sort of being paramount. You know, a lot of teachers and educators across, and we count educators as anyone who works with kids. So I just want to clarify that for this question. There's a lot of fear about talking about what's happening right now. And it's really just that self-regulation, co-regulation. Do you have any tips on what educators can do right now in the summer for themselves to be able to prepare for some of those conversations in the fall?
I do. There are an amazing number of resources now on the web, and I know that you've been placing many of those on the Pure Edge website, and we would be glad to add to them. I think partly it's educating ourselves about the effects of trauma, and both on ourselves and others. I think also it's preparing ourselves to be calm and to be ready, if you will. And one of the things we've been doing at Create is we've been doing internet-based webinars with staffs around the country, helping the staffs themselves to work through some of the issues that they have encountered and to begin to use both their own emotional awareness and mindfulness practices, as you've been doing, Chi, in the Pure Edge webinars every day of the week.
192 of them.
192 of them. I think to help people to be calmer now in the present as a way of also helping them to be ready when the doors open again.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize all the educators that we work with sort of across the country, and as you as well, as they are so giving of themselves, and they always forget to take care of themselves and how important that is. And I think especially with the equity issues that are coming up with health and wellness, and even just the aspect of health, that equity issue is very clear in just the health outcomes, even based on the numbers from COVID cases and also and death. So I think that piece for the wellness is critical. And we'd be happy to house more of your resources, Mark. So please let us know. There's a question.
If I can add that, it's not just the educators, although it depends on how broad we were talking about it. It's the bus drivers.
Yes.
And it's the people working in the lunchroom, and it's the after-school staffs. So, for example, we've been working with after-school staffs in Philadelphia, and we'll be working in Denver to work with the fact that they have what they've lost basically, and how they can become ready again. And of course, many of them are because many of these jobs are essential low-income jobs. They are often very stressed by what's happening now. Often have children or grandparents in their home, have literally no time for themselves, and have substantial economic worries. And so these are people that are essential to our work to make children, to help children to learn, to create this loving, caring environment. As we know, many children at school feel more attached. I felt more attached to the custodian in my school than any of my teachers. He was the person that I would hang out with. And it's true for many kids. It could be someone in the cafeteria or the school secretary. There are many adults around the buildings and on the buses that can create the kind of relationships that children need to be seen and to be respected. And we need to think about all of these people and how we can support them.
You bring up such a great point, Mark. I feel like that is one thing that I hope, even when the reentry plans, right? We have a lot of groups that are coming and gathering, and they're sort of, these teams, but just making sure we include the school nurses, the director of food services, director of the transportation, all of them. So thank you so much for the reminder. Every adult matters, and just having one caring adult, as we all know, could literally change the trajectory for a child. We're going to close out, Dorothy, just because I feel like you actually had brought that up, and there was a question in the boxes. Would you please speak a little bit more about the path forward for school districts to engage with the model CREATE has in place? We'd love to be able to highlight your work.
Yes, thank you. And Mark, do we have a screen we can share?
Well, sorry, my technology will take you. Go ahead and talk, Dorothy.
That's okay. So as I said, we have this curriculum ready to go, and it is a train the trainer model where actually Joe, Denine, Mark, and myself will be training either principals or teachers or counselors or other community leaders to actually present this to schools and to other sites. And we also have the second part, which I explained a little bit earlier, when districts can really become involved. And really when you have a district like Denine was talking about, when someone really takes SEL on, when you take this on, teachers feel valued. And teachers feel like they can do a better job because someone's helping them learn how to take care of themselves. And as a former teacher, I know we try to take care of everyone else, but we really have to deal with us first, and then we could be more healthy to help our students. So Mark has, thank you, Mark, because I'm technically challenged. I sure couldn't have done this, so thank you. So Mark has this up, how you can contact us. You can also go to our website to learn more about Care and Calm, createforeducation.org. We look forward to working with you all. We feel like the work together, we'll learn from each other, and we know that teachers are the key to our success in this country. So we've had a wonderful day engaging with you all today, and we hope to hear from each and every one of you. So Mark, any comments?
No, I think you've said it all, Dorothy. It's been a pleasure to be with everyone. We hope that everyone has learned something from this, taken something away, and we hope that you all stay safe and improve your well-being as we move towards the reentry of school.
And Mark, I was wondering if all the panelists can come back. If you could stop sharing your screen, have all the panelists come back.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I would love to just close out, as we've done with the Castle signature practices, with an optimistic closure, and just would love to hear from each of you just one hope for us as we continue our work in the field of education, and just for our own country and for the world. So one statement of a hope that you have.
I hope we create a more just society in our schools, create the kinds of dreams and hopes that can be realized for all children.
And I hope that there is equity throughout the world for everyone.
I hope that we take the time to recognize the need for SEL instruction and building that capacity in our students. I also hope that we as educators take the time to take care of ourselves so that we can be successful with our children. So
and I hope that through this all, teachers have really seen how valued and how needed they are in our country. And that my hope is that you just move forward with this next school year empowered and knowing your worth and your value.
And I have a final hope for our participants as well, is that I hope that you will continue just on being compassionate for yourself, right? Be kind to yourself. I think we are really hard on ourselves of what we can and should be doing, and just know we're so grateful that you joined us today. I'm so grateful for the panel. And when we talk about teachers, please know, in terms of participants, anybody who works with a child in schools, we consider teachers. It's not just in the classroom, but as Mark shared, with all of the roles in schools for the cafeteria, custodians, and counselors. Everybody who touches a child's life in a school system is considered a teacher in our hearts and in our minds, and that's how we operate. So we just want to make sure we're being inclusive of all. Thank you so much, Mark, for the opening for commemorating Juneteenth. It was so important, and I think that's something that we can all sort of hope for as well, that it becomes a national holiday. So with that, we are off. If you are joining us for any of our other webinars, this will be recorded. This is being recorded and will be posted. If you are a part of any of the CASEL webinars, they're starting one at 1 o'clock. They're starting theirs as well with SEL and equity. So if you want to pop over to another place after you take a stretch and do a little self-care, we hope that you enjoy that as well. And we're so grateful. We'll get an email to all the participants within 24 hours. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a beautiful weekend.